Marcus Washington stared in disbelief at the blood trickling down his hand as the entire plane fell silent. Just seconds earlier, flight attendant Karen Whitfield had violently shoved him against the metal compartment, hissing, "Your kind belongs in the back," when he tried to return to his first-class seat. His military ID clutched in his trembling hand, Marcus reached for his phone. One call to his Pentagon superior would ground this entire aircraft, but he never imagined the devastating chain reaction that single call would trigger. What happens when a decorated veteran stands up against discrimination at 40,000 feet? Before we begin this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in justice for all, hit that like and subscribe button to stay updated on more powerful true stories. Colonel Marcus Washington was no ordinary passenger. At 43 years old, his 2 decades of military service had earned him a chest full of medals, including the Purple Heart and Bronze Star from multiple tours across Afghanistan and Iraq. Today should have been like any other first-class flight, except this one was taking him to Atlanta to bury his mother. The crisp lines of his dress uniform did little to hide the weight of grief on his shoulders as he approached the gate at Reagan National. "Next passenger," called the gate agent without looking up. When Marcus stepped forward, she finally raised her eyes. "Sorry, sir. We're boarding first class right now. Economy will begin boarding in about 20 minutes. "I'm flying first class," Marcus replied politely, sliding his boarding pass across the counter. The gate agent squinted at the ticket, then at Marcus before reluctantly scanning it. "Oh, I see. Go ahead." Her tone carried unmistakable surprise. As Marcus walked down the jet bridge, he couldn't help but notice the white passengers flowing freely past the gate agents with barely a glance at their tickets. Yet somehow, he'd been questioned despite being in full military dress uniform. When he reached the aircraft door, a blonde flight attendant with a tight smile and name tag reading Karen Whitfield blocked his path. "Boarding pass, please," she demanded with a scrutinizing gaze that made it clear his uniform carried no weight with her. "First class is this way," she said with obvious skepticism after inspecting his ticket longer than necessary, pointing toward the front cabin while keeping her eyes fixed on him, as if expecting him to make a wrong move. Marcus nodded politely and proceeded toward his seat, but couldn't miss overhearing Karen whisper to another flight attendant, "I'm watching that one. They always try to sneak up front." When Marcus finally reached row 3, he found his window. Seat occupied by a middle-aged white man in a business suit who barely looked up from his laptop. "Excuse me, sir. I believe you're in my seat," Marcus said. The man glanced up with annoyance. "No, this is my seat." "I have 3A. Marcus showed him the boarding pass. "I always sit by the window. Ask the flight attendant to sort it out." "The ER," man replied dismissively. Marcus pressed the call button, and moments later, Karen appeared. Before Marcus could speak, she turned directly to the white passenger. "Is there a problem, sir?" "This gentleman claims I'm in his seat," the businessman replied. Karen turned to Marcus with immediate suspicion. "Let me see your boarding pass." "Again," she demanded, despite having checked it minutes earlier at the door. "Sir, you're holding up the boarding process," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Are you sure you're not confused about your seat assignment?" Several passengers were now watching as the line behind Marcus grew. Some were pulling out phones, seemingly ready to record another difficult passenger incident. "I'm not confused," Marcus replied calmly, pointing to his clearly marked seat assignment. Karen scrutinized the boarding pass again before reluctantly turning to the white passenger. "Sir, it seems there's been a mix-up. Would you mind taking your assigned seat?" The businessman sighed dramatically before gathering his things, muttering under his breath about accommodations and the way things are going these days. As Marcus finally settled into his rightful seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be different for all the wrong reasons. The red eye to Atlanta stretched before him, a journey that should have been filled with memories of his mother, not the familiar sting of unwarranted suspicion he'd faced his entire life, even in uniform. 20 minutes into the flight, Marcus needed to use the restroom. He carefully stepped past his sleeping roommate and made his way forward to the first-class lavatory. Inside, he splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the mounting tension. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Hold your head high no matter what they throw at you. She had raised him alone after his father, also a military man, died in service when Marcus was just 8 years old. As Marcus exited the bathroom and turned to return to his seat, Karen Whitfield suddenly materialized before him, arms crossed, blocking the narrow aisle completely. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely, attempting to step around her. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" Karen's voice was ice cold, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Back to my seat, 3A," Marcus replied, maintaining his composure. "I need to see some identification," she demanded, loud enough for nearby passengers to turn and stare. "Ma'am, I was just in my seat 5 minutes ago, and you've already checked my boarding pass twice," Marcus explained calmly. "You people always cause problems," Karen hissed, stepping closer. "First-class passengers have been complaining about feeling uncomfortable." Marcus felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, but kept his voice level. "What exactly do you mean? By you people?" "You know exactly what I mean," Karen spat back. "Now show me identification or return to your proper seat in the back." "My proper seat is 3A, first class," Marcus stated firmly, attempting once more to step past her. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, when passengers described it, their accounts varied only in small details. Karen Whitfield planted both hands on Colonel Washington's chest and violently shoved him backward. Marcus, caught off guard, stumbled against a metal fixture protruding from the galley wall. A sharp edge sliced into his hand while the impact shattered the crystal face of his father's vintage Omega watch, a family heirloom he'd worn through 3 combat tours. The collective gasp from witnessing passengers filled the cabin as a trickle of blood ran down Marcus's wrist, staining his immaculate uniform cuff. Smartphone cameras emerged from seat pockets throughout first class, their lenses capturing the moment a decorated military officer stood bleeding while a flight attendant screamed for security. "He assaulted me!" Karen shrieked into her radio. "Security to the front cabin immediately! I have a threatening passenger!" Marcus stood perfectly still, his military training kicking in as he controlled his breathing and assessed the situation. 2 decades of combat had taught him that even the strongest emotional response must be channeled productively. He reached slowly into his breast pocket and retrieved a handkerchief to wrap around his bleeding hand. "I did not touch this woman," he stated clearly for the benefit of the recording phones. "She pushed me into that metal fixture without provocation." Within minutes, 2 airline security officers rushed onto the plane, immediately positioning themselves on either side of Marcus as though he were the aggressor. "Sir, we need you to come with us," the taller officer demanded, reaching for Marcus's arm. "Before anyone touches me again," Marcus replied with quiet dignity. "I suggest you look at the footage these passengers have recorded." The security officers hesitated, suddenly aware of the dozen phones pointed in their direction. One passenger, a young woman in row 2, spoke up. "I recorded the whole thing. She pushed him for no reason and he's bleeding." The taller security officer turned to Karen, whose face had transformed from righteous indignation to uncertainty. "He was being aggressive," she insisted, though her voice had lost its conviction. Marcus slowly reached into his other pocket and produced his military ID. "Colonel Marcus Washington, United States Army, 22 years of service. I've been checking flight procedures, and I believe what just happened constitutes assault, discriminatory treatment, and a violation of federal aviation regulations." The security officer's demeanor changed instantly. The shorter one, apparently recognizing the rank, straightened his posture almost involuntarily. "Sir, I apologize for the confusion. Perhaps we can resolve this situation." But the damage had been done. Marcus Washington had been publicly humiliated, physically assaulted, and racially profiled while wearing the uniform he'd nearly died in multiple times defending his country. Have you ever witnessed discrimination happen right before your eyes? Would you have spoken up if you saw what these passengers saw? Comment number 1 if you believe Karen's actions were clearly motivated by racial bias, or number 2 if you think there might be more to the story. Hit that like button if you admire Marcus's incredible self-control in such a degrading situation, and subscribe now to hear what happened when this decorated veteran decided enough was enough. What could one phone call possibly accomplish against a major airline? Stay tuned to find out how Marcus Washington's next move would ground an entire aircraft and launch a national conversation about respect, service, and equality in America. The cabin hummed with tension as Colonel Washington, still standing in the aisle with security officers flanking him, made a decision. He pulled out his phone, ignoring Karen Whitfield's immediate protest. "Sir, all mobile devices must remain in airplane mode during flight," she said, desperation creeping into her voice as she realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control. "I'm aware of the regulations," Marcus replied calmly, his eyes never leaving hers as he pressed a number on speed dial. "I'm also aware of the exceptions for emergency situations, which this has become." The phone connected almost immediately. "Lieutenant General Harrison," answered a deep voice that carried the unmistakable tone of command. "James, it's Marcus," he said, his voice steady despite the blood still seeping through the handkerchief wrapped around his hand. "I need your assistance." Lieutenant General James Harrison wasn't just Marcus's superior at the Pentagon. He was the man whose son had died in Marcus's arms during a rescue operation in Kandahar 7 years earlier. The bond between them ran deeper than rank or protocol could measure. Marcus explained the situation with military precision, omitting emotional details but ensuring Harrison understood the severity of what had transpired. Throughout the call, Karen shifted nervously, her earlier confidence evaporating as she realized who Marcus was speaking with. "Stay where you are," Harrison instructed. "Do not leave that aircraft voluntarily under any circumstances. I'm contacting the airline's executive team and the FAA directly." As Marcus ended the call, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. We'll be holding at our current position while we sort things out. Flight attendants, please prepare for possible return to gate." The security officers, now visibly uncomfortable, stepped back from Marcus. "Sir, perhaps we could discuss this privately," one suggested, gesturing toward the galley. "There's nothing to discuss privately," Marcus replied. "What happened was witnessed by an entire cabin of passengers." Karen had retreated to huddle, with the lead flight attendant and the co-pilot, who had emerged from the cockpit to assess the situation. Their whispered conversation was punctuated by nervous glances in Marcus's direction. 20 minutes later, the aircraft began a gentle, banking turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "due to an onboard situation, we've been instructed to return to Reagan National. We apologize for the inconvenience." As the plane taxied back to the terminal, 3 individuals in airline management, attire boarded before any passengers could deplane. They quickly pulled Karen and Marcus aside into separate areas for conversation. "Colonel Washington," began a woman with a corporate name badge identifying her as Regional Director of Customer Experience. "We want to express our deepest regrets for this unfortunate misunderstanding." She slid a folder across the galley counter, toward him. "Inside you'll find vouchers for 10 first-class tickets, a year of premium status, and our most sincere apologies. We're prepared to resolve this situation immediately and get everyone back on their journey." Marcus didn't touch the folder. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," he stated. "This was a clear case of racial discrimination and assault by your employee, witnessed by dozens of passengers." The woman's professional smile tightened. "Colonel, pursuing this matter formally would make things difficult for everyone involved. The delay, the investigations, the media attention, none of us want that, especially with your mother's funeral arrangements pending." Marcus felt a cold stillness settle over him, the same clarity he'd experienced in combat when critical decisions needed to be made in split seconds. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and placed his phone on the counter between them. The voice recorder app was running. "I believe you were about to threaten me with consequences for reporting racial discrimination," he said quietly. "Please continue. I want to make sure I understand the airline's official position." The color drained from the woman's face. "That's not, I wasn't, the vouchers are simply..." Behind them, the captain appeared. "We've been instructed by company headquarters to deplane all passengers immediately. This aircraft is officially grounded pending an investigation." As passengers began gathering their belongings amid confused murmurs, Marcus Washington stood tall in his uniform, already knowing that what had begun as a personal humiliation was about to become something much larger than himself. By the time Colonel Washington reached the terminal, escorted by airline representatives who maintained a careful distance, the first video had already been uploaded. A passenger from row 4 had captured the entire incident on her phone and posted it with the caption, "Black Army Colonel assaulted by racist flight attendant on flight 1382 today. He's literally bleeding. Justice for Marcus. Flying while black." Within an hour, 3 more angles of the confrontation appeared online. By dinner time, cable news networks were running the footage on a continuous loop, each showing Karen Whitfield clearly shoving a uniformed military officer and his stunned, dignified response. Marcus's phone began lighting up with notifications and calls from unknown numbers. Journalists had somehow obtained his contact information and were desperate for comments. Meanwhile, internet sleuths had already identified Karen Whitfield and begun digging through her social media history, uncovering a troubling pattern of racially charged posts and comments stretching back years. "Colonel, you need to see this," said Sergeant Phillips, Marcus's aide who had been waiting at the airport to drive him to his hotel. He handed Marcus his tablet, open to a financial news site where the airline's stock had plummeted 7% in a matter of hours, wiping nearly $1 billion from its market capitalization. As they drove to the hotel, the radio news reported that the airline's CEO had issued a statement. "We are deeply concerned by the video footage circulating online and are conducting a thorough investigation into the incident. This appears to be an unfortunate miscommunication between our crew member and a valued customer. Trans-American Airways has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind." Marcus listened silently, noting the carefully crafted language that acknowledged no wrongdoing while attempting to frame a violent, racially motivated assault as mere miscommunication. At the hotel, Marcus finally had a moment alone to call his sister Danielle, who was already in Atlanta making funeral arrangements for their mother. "Marcus, it's all over the news," Danielle said, her voice tight with concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he assured her, though the cut on his hand throbbed and the memory of Karen's words, "Your kind belongs in the back," kept replaying in his mind. "But I don't think I'll make it to Atlanta tonight." "Mom would understand," Danielle said softly. "You know how she always told us to stand up when it matters." After their call, Marcus finally allowed himself to check social media. The hashtags, Justice for Marcus and Flying While Black, were trending nationwide. His military record and decorations had been made public, creating a wave of support from veterans groups and civil rights organizations alike. But there was another narrative emerging as well. Karen Whitfield had retained Jeffrey Schmidt, a high-profile attorney known for defending clients in racial controversy cases. They had released a statement claiming Karen had felt threatened by Marcus's aggressive demeanor and was simply following safety protocols established by the airline. Several conservative commentators had already begun questioning why Marcus had escalated the situation by making a privileged call to high-ranking military officials instead of following standard complaint procedures. By morning, the story had reached international news. Marcus received a call from a producer at GNN, offering him a live interview slot on their evening broadcast. Despite his reluctance to become the center of a media circus, Marcus understood that controlling the narrative was essential. That evening, millions watched as he appeared on screen in his full-dress uniform, the Purple Heart and Bronze Star visible on his chest, as he recounted the events with the same calm dignity he had shown on the aircraft. "I've dedicated 22 years of my life to defending this country," he told the interviewer, his voice steady. "I've bled for America in 2 wars, and yet, wearing this uniform, I was treated like a criminal for simply trying to return to the seat I had paid for." When asked what justice would look like for him, Marcus responded, "This isn't about me. It's about acknowledging that no American should be treated differently because of the color of their skin. Not in combat, not on an airplane, not anywhere. In the country we all serve." The interview catapulted Marcus into the national spotlight. Civil rights leaders called him a hero for standing up. Military organizations rallied around one of their own. The airline faced mounting pressure as Boycott hashtags began trending. But with this visibility came vulnerability. The funeral service for Marcus's mother, originally planned as a small family gathering, now required police presence to keep media and onlookers at a respectful distance. Marcus had to postpone his arrival in Atlanta, missing the chance to help his sister with final arrangements, a fact that cut him more deeply than Karen's physical assault ever could. As he finally lay down to sleep in his hotel room, surrounded by the constant ping of notifications and the muted sound of his name being discussed on 24-hour news channels, Colonel Marcus Washington closed his eyes and wondered if making that call had been worth the storm it unleashed. The morning after his television interview, Marcus woke to a breaking news alert on his phone. The headline turned his blood cold. Colonel Washington's mental health history raises questions about airline incident. Somehow Karen's legal team had obtained his private medical records, revealing that Marcus had been prescribed anxiety medication for combat-related PTSD. The article implied that his perception of events might have been distorted by his condition and medication. "This is a decorated veteran who has served honorably," Schmidt told reporters outside his office. "But we cannot ignore the fact that Colonel Washington was under the influence of powerful prescription drugs that can cause paranoia and aggression. My client was responding to behavior that legitimately concerned her as a safety professional." Marcus's phone rang. It was Lieutenant General Harrison. "They're playing dirty, Marcus," Harrison said without preamble. "Someone leaked your confidential medical files to Schmidt. We're investigating how that happened, but right now you need to prepare for more." "More?" Marcus asked, though he already knew what was coming. "Anonymous sources within the airline are claiming you have a history of confrontational behavior on flights. They're citing an incident from 3 years ago where you supposedly argued with a flight attendant about overhead bin space." Marcus remembered the incident they were twisting. A white passenger had removed his carefully placed uniform from an overhead bin, crumpling it, and the flight attendant had blamed Marcus for the resulting dispute. By midday, the narrative had expanded further. A conservative news site published an article detailing Marcus's divorce 5 years earlier, implying without evidence that it involved misconduct on his part. The reality, his ex-wife had left him. During his third deployment, unable to cope with the stress of military life, was nowhere in their reporting. That evening, Karen Whitfield appeared on the highest-rated cable talk show, seated beside her attorney. She looked nothing like the aggressive woman from the airplane. Her voice quavered as she described feeling terrified when Marcus aggressively approached her. "I've served passengers of all backgrounds for 27 years, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "To be labeled a racist and have my career destroyed by cancel culture when I was just doing my job, it's devastating." The host nodded sympathetically. "And now you're receiving death threats?" "My children are afraid to go to school," Karen said, though Marcus knew from the background research his legal team had conducted that her only child was a 30-year-old son living in Europe. The next blow came in the form of a doctored video that began circulating online, showing only Marcus's reaction after being pushed, with the crucial moment of Karen's assault edited out. Without context, he appeared to be overreacting to a routine interaction. Lieutenant General Harrison called again. "They're going through your entire military record looking for anything they can use against you. And Marcus, there's something else. Your daughter Aisha called my office. Some classmates have been harassing her at school, showing her altered videos and saying her father is trying to ruin an innocent woman's life." Marcus sat heavily on the edge of his hotel bed. Aisha was 16, a straight-A student with dreams of following him into the service academy. The thought of her facing harassment because of his stand cut deeper than any physical wound. That evening, he received a text from an Army colleague. "Thinking of you, brother, but command advised us not to comment publicly on your situation. Sorry." One by one, military friends who had initially voiced support began to distance themselves as the controversy grew. The Pentagon issued a terse statement that the incident was a private matter not related to Colonel Washington's official duties, and declined further comment. Marcus stared at his reflection in the hotel bathroom mirror. Was this fight worth the collateral damage to his career, his family, and the memory of his mother, whose funeral had become a media circus? For the first time since the incident, Doubt crept into his mind. Would you stand your ground if powerful forces tried to twist your truth? Comment number 1. If you believe Marcus should continue fighting despite the smear campaign. Or number 2, if you think the personal costs are becoming too high. Hit the like button if you've ever witnessed how quickly the media can flip a narrative against someone standing up for what's right. And subscribe now to see how Marcus responds to these devastating attacks on his character and family. When it seems like the entire system is aligned against one man, where can he possibly turn for allies? The answer will surprise you in our next segment. As Colonel Washington's character assassination continued across media channels, an unexpected movement began to take shape. It started with a social media post from Master Sergeant Terrence Jackson, a retired black veteran who had served under Marcus in Iraq. I know this man's character. He led us through hell and brought us home. If he says it happened, it happened. I stand with Washington. Within 24 hours, the hashtag had been used by thousands of veterans of all races, a coalition calling themselves Veterans Against Discrimination formed almost overnight, with retired service members organizing press conferences in cities across America. Then came the first crack in the airline's defense. An anonymous flight attendant who worked with Karen Whitfield contacted Marcus's newly hired attorney, providing screenshots of crew messages where Karen had repeatedly used racial slurs and complained about having to serve those people in first class. Marcus's former commander, retired General William Peterson, a white man with impeccable credentials who rarely spoke publicly, released a video statement. In 28 years of service, I never met an officer with more integrity than Marcus Washington. Anyone attempting to question his character clearly has never served alongside him. The tide began to shift further when Air Marshal Jackson Burns, who had been on the flight, finally came forward. Burns had initially hesitated to get involved, but watching the smear campaign unfold compelled him to speak up. I was seated in first class monitoring the flight, as is standard procedure, Burns stated in an affidavit. I witnessed Ms. Whitfield treat Colonel Washington with contempt from the moment he boarded, despite his military uniform and proper ticket. The assault occurred exactly as the colonel has described it. I am coming forward now because I cannot allow this distortion of truth to continue. Security camera footage from the gate area emerged, clearly showing Karen's different treatment of white passengers versus passengers of color during boarding. Several former passengers came forward with stories of similar treatment by Karen on other flights, establishing a pattern of behavior that could not be explained away as a single misunderstanding. The airline's carefully constructed narrative began to unravel further when employees, disgusted by the company's handling of the situation, leaked internal emails showing that management had received multiple complaints about Karen's behavior toward minority passengers over the years, but had taken no action. In a stunning development, Captain Richard Stevens, who had piloted the flight in question, broke ranks with the airline. I've worked for Transamerican for 18 years, he told a morning news program. What I saw in the aftermath of that incident was a company more concerned with protecting itself than addressing a clear case of misconduct. Colonel Washington's account is accurate, and I cannot in good conscience remain silent. The airline, seeing the tide of public opinion turning, announced an internal investigation, but it was too little, too late. Senator Eleanor Washington, no relation to Marcus, chair of the Transportation Committee, called for congressional hearings on discrimination in the airline industry. What happened to Colonel Washington is not an isolated incident, the senator stated during a press conference. It is emblematic of a pattern of discrimination that many Americans face daily in our transportation systems. It's time for accountability. With each new ally and piece of evidence, Marcus found his resolve strengthening. The doubts that had plagued him began to recede. This wasn't just about one incident on one flight anymore. It had become about something much larger. Accountability for a system that too often treated people differently based on the color of their skin, regardless of their service or contributions to the country. As Marcus prepared for a meeting with Senator Washington's staff, he received an unexpected call from a number he didn't recognize. "Colonel Washington," said an unfamiliar voice. "My name is Elijah Montgomery. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I believe you have a case that could set an important precedent for transportation discrimination. I'd like to offer my services pro bono." Montgomery wasn't just any attorney. He had successfully argued multiple landmark civil rights cases before the Supreme Court. His involvement would send a clear message that this case had implications far beyond one flight attendant and one passenger. "Why would you take this on without a fee?" Marcus asked, naturally, suspicious after days of attacks and hidden agendas. "Because 20 years ago, I was that black man being told I didn't belong in first class," Montgomery replied. "But I didn't have a Pentagon general on speed dial. Most people don't. Your case can help all of them." For the first time in days, Marcus felt the weight on his shoulders lighten slightly. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. With Elijah Montgomery leading his legal team, Colonel Washington filed a discrimination lawsuit against Trans-American Airways and Karen Whitfield personally. The complaint detailed not only the assault, but the pattern of discrimination preceding it and the coordinated attempt to discredit him afterward. The airline's response was swift. Their legal department reached out within hours, offering a 7-figure settlement with strict non-disclosure requirements. The sum was substantial enough to secure Aisha's college education and then some, but the conditions were clear. Marcus would have to drop all claims, issue a joint statement with the airline about misunderstandings, and never speak publicly about the incident again. "That's their first offer," Montgomery explained during a strategy session in his downtown office. "It tells us they're scared, very scared." "I don't want their money," Marcus replied, looking at the settlement figures. "I want accountability and real change." "Then we push back," Montgomery said with a smile that suggested he'd been hoping for exactly that response. "We demand policy changes, transparent reporting of discrimination complaints, and mandatory training for all staff, not just carefully worded apologies and hush money." As news of the lawsuit broke, the airline executives panicked. Marcus wasn't the only one pursuing legal action anymore. His stand had inspired other passengers who had experienced similar discrimination to come forward with their own stories and legal claims. Class action specialists were beginning to circle. Karen Whitfield, seeing herself increasingly isolated as more evidence emerged, filed a countersuit against Marcus for defamation, claiming his accusations had destroyed her career and subjected her to public hatred. It was a desperate move that few legal analysts gave any chance of success, but it ensured the conflict would continue to make headlines. Trans-American Airways attempted to distance itself from Karen, while still avoiding admission of any systemic issues. Their public statements carefully acknowledged concerns about the incident, while emphasizing their long-standing commitment to diversity and inclusion. Behind closed doors, however, the situation was far more dire. Insurance underwriters were refusing to cover the potential damages, citing the airline's failure to address previous complaints about Karen as negligence. Board members were demanding answers about how the situation had been allowed to escalate so dramatically. For Marcus, the legal battle brought mounting pressure. Although Montgomery had taken the case pro bono, there were still expenses accumulating, and the time commitment was affecting his ability to return to active duty. The Army had placed him on administrative leave, pending resolution of personal matters, a bureaucratic limbo that threatened his career advancement. Then came an unexpected development. An anonymous donor offered to cover all of Marcus's legal expenses and personal costs during the lawsuit. The funds were arranged through a trust that Montgomery verified as legitimate, but could not or would not identify further. "Someone with means believes in what you're doing," was all Montgomery would say. The case was fast becoming a national reference point for transportation discrimination. Legal scholars wrote analyses of its potential impact. Civil rights organizations filed amicus briefs supporting Marcus's claims. Transportation industry publications ran features examining how the outcome might affect policies across airlines, railways, and other carriers. As the case gained prominence, Trans-American's legal team shifted tactics, launching subtle attacks on Elijah Montgomery's reputation. They hired investigators to dig into his past cases, looking for any hint of impropriety or conflict of interest. Articles began appearing questioning his motives and suggesting he was using Marcus to further his own agenda. "They're desperate," Montgomery told Marcus when confronted with a particularly vicious piece claiming he had mishandled a previous civil rights case. When they can't attack the facts, they attack the messengers. It means we're winning. But winning in the court of public opinion didn't guarantee victory in actual court. Transamerican had resources that could extend the legal battle for years, draining Marcus financially and emotionally. And as the discovery phase began, their attorneys demanded access to his complete military and medical records, threatening to expose every private struggle he'd ever faced to public scrutiny. As the pressure intensified, Marcus found his resolve, being tested daily. Yet each morning he put on his uniform and remembered his mother's words. Justice isn't something you seek only when it's convenient. It's something you pursue especially when it's hard. 3 months into the legal battle, the constant pressure began taking a visible toll on Marcus. The media scrutiny, legal obligations, and ongoing character assassination triggered PTSD symptoms he had managed to keep under control for years. Night terrors returned. His hands sometimes shook during interviews. Each attack required more energy to withstand, energy he increasingly didn't have. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday. Aisha called, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Dad, Princeton rejected my application." "That doesn't make sense," Marcus replied, instantly alert. "Your grades, your extracurriculars, your essays, I reviewed them myself. You're exactly the kind of student they look for." The rejection letter mentioned concerns about fit with university values, Aisha said quietly. "Dad, they rejected me because of our last name." That same afternoon, a package arrived at Marcus's temporary apartment. It contained no return address, just a manila envelope with dozens of printed death threats collected from social media and message boards, many including his address and Aisha's school information. The implicit message was clear. "We know where you and your family are vulnerable." Marcus immediately contacted law enforcement, but their response was frustratingly routine. They took a report and promised to increase patrols, but had limited resources to offer actual protection. That evening, Karen Whitfield gave another emotional interview, this time tearfully explaining how she had been made a scapegoat for the airline's corporate policies. "They told us to be vigilant about certain passengers," she claimed, carefully avoiding specific racial terms while letting viewers draw their own conclusions. "Now, they're sacrificing me to protect themselves." Her performance was masterful, painting herself as a victim of corporate greed rather than an instigator of racial hatred. Overnight, hashtags supporting Karen began trending, and a crowdfunding campaign for her legal defense raised over $100,000 in 24 hours. The next morning, Marcus received a call from the Pentagon. The conversation was brief but devastating. "Colonel, your promotion to Brigadier General has been delayed for administrative review," said a voice he barely recognized as belonging to a man he'd once considered a friend. "Nothing personal, you understand. Just procedure given the current circumstances." The promotion had been all but guaranteed before the incident, a recognition of his exemplary service record and leadership abilities. Now it was being held hostage to force his compliance and silence. Later that week, as Marcus finally traveled to Atlanta for a delayed memorial service for his mother, he found the cemetery surrounded by media vans and photographers. What should have been a private moment of grief had become a spectacle. Some reporters even shouted questions as he stood by his mother's grave. When he returned to his hotel room that night, Marcus found an email from a senior Army official. The message was carefully worded, but clear. The Army was suggesting he consider the broader implications of his continued pursuit of the case and perhaps find a resolution that allows all parties to move forward. In other words, let it go. For the good of the service, for the good of your career. Sitting alone in the dark hotel room, Marcus felt the weight of it all finally becoming too much to bear. The lawsuit was draining him financially despite the anonymous donor. Aisha was suffering. His military career, the center of his identity for over 20 years, was being systematically dismantled. And for what? A principle? Justice that might never come. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Elijah Montgomery's number, his finger hovering over the call button. One conversation could end this, He could accept the settlement, sign the NDA, and try to rebuild some semblance of his former life. As midnight approached, Marcus found himself standing on the hotel balcony, looking down at the city lights below. 20 floors up, the traffic looked like streams of light, problems reduced to miniatures. How easy it would be to make everything. Stop the pressure, the pain, the constant fight. One moment of surrender to gravity, and it would all be over. His phone buzzed with a text message. Marcus almost didn't check it, but some lingering instinct made him look at the screen. It was from a number he didn't recognize. Colonel Washington, you don't know me, but I'm a black veteran too. Saw what you're going through. Been there myself 2 years ago. Almost didn't make it. Please call the number below if you're in a dark place tonight. We stand watch together, sir. No man left behind. Marcus stared at the message, then at the city below, then back at the phone. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number. Have you ever reached a breaking point where giving up seemed like the only option? Comment number 1 if you faced a moment when standing up for what's right felt like it was costing too much. Or number 2 if you've been the person reaching out to someone in crisis. Hit that like button if you believe even our strongest heroes need support sometimes. And subscribe to find out if this mystery caller might be the lifeline Marcus desperately needs. When you've lost everything fighting for justice, is there any way back from the edge? The surprising revelation coming next will change everything about this case. The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to Sergeant Major Raymond Wilson, a 25-year Army veteran who had faced his own discrimination battle against the same airline 2 years earlier. Their conversation lasted until dawn, with Wilson sharing his own journey through darkness and eventually back to purpose. As the sun rose over Atlanta, Marcus made a decision to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who lacked the platform he had. What neither man knew was that at that exact moment, a young IT specialist named Darius Chen was working late in Trans-American Airways headquarters, troubled by what he had witnessed over the past months. As a system administrator with high-level access, Darius had been instructed to securely archive certain communications related to the Washington case. Instead, he had been quietly copying them. The next morning, Marcus received an encrypted email from an anonymous address containing dozens of internal communications between airline executives. The sender identified himself only as someone who can't sleep at night anymore. The documents were explosive. Email chains showed airline AA executives discussing how to handle the minority situation months before the incident with Marcus. One executive had written, "These first-class race complaints are increasing. Need better training on how to discourage without creating liability." Another email thread revealed systematic instructions to flight attendants about passenger profiling that clearly targeted non-white travelers for additional scrutiny, particularly in premium cabins. Most damaging of all was Karen Whitfield's personnel file, showing 5 previous incidents of passenger complaints about racial bias that had been systematically buried by management. In one case, she had been briefly suspended but then reinstated after what was described as sensitivity counseling, that, according to attached documents, consisted of a 1-hour online course. There were memos detailing the airline's superficial diversity training program that had never been fully implemented beyond press releases announcing its creation. One internal presentation explicitly stated that the program was designed to create positive PR while minimizing operational changes. The leak also included videos from staff training sessions where Karen had been recorded making explicitly racist comments during role-playing exercises, followed by a trainer's notes indicating needs additional coaching on appropriate language, yet she had been kept in her customer-facing role. Marcus immediately forwarded everything to Elijah Montgomery, who assembled an emergency team to authenticate the documents. By midnight, they had verified the communications through digital signatures and metadata analysis. "This changes everything," Montgomery told Marcus by secure video call. "They can't claim this was an isolated incident or blame it all on Karen. These documents prove systemic discrimination as official policy." While Montgomery's team worked to properly introduce the evidence into legal proceedings, another bombshell dropped. Financial journalists discovered that the airline had settled at least 7 previous discrimination cases with strict NDAs, effectively buying the silence of victims while continuing the same practices. the Federal Aviation Administration launched a formal investigation into the airline's compliance with anti-discrimination regulations. Department of Transportation officials began reviewing whether Trans-American had violated federal requirements in their handling of previous complaints. The most damning revelation came when forensic accountants hired by Montgomery's team discovered evidence that Trans-American's legal department had deliberately destroyed documents after Marcus's incident, attempting to hide the pattern of discrimination. This potential obstruction of justice caught the attention of the Department of Justice, which opened its own investigation. Karen Whitfield's attorney withdrew from her case, citing irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy, a professional way of saying he could no longer defend her against the overwhelming evidence. Her countersuit against Marcus was dismissed by the court for lack of merit. As these revelations cascaded through media outlets, Marcus received another unexpected call. Lieutenant General Harrison's voice was grim, but satisfied. "The Pentagon. Investigation into your leaked medical records is complete. We traced it to a civilian contractor working for the airline's legal team. They're being charged under federal privacy laws. And Marcus, your promotion to Brigadier General has been reinstated, effective immediately." For the first time since that day on the plane, Marcus felt the weight on his shoulders beginning to lift. The truth was finally emerging, and with it, the possibility of real change not just for him, but for everyone who had ever faced similar discrimination. The congressional hearing room was packed to capacity. News cameras lined the back wall, their lenses focused on the long table where Colonel, now Brigadier General Marcus Washington, sat in his full-dress uniform, medals reflecting the harsh lighting. Senator Eleanor Washington gavelled the Transportation Committee hearing to order. "Today, we examine not just one incident, but a pattern of discrimination in our nation's transportation systems," she announced. "Our first witness is Brigadier General Marcus Washington." Marcus approached the microphone with the same composure he had shown throughout the ordeal. For nearly an hour, he recounted not only what had happened on the plane, but the subsequent campaign to discredit him and the systemic issues revealed by the leaked documents. "This was never about one flight attendant or one airline," he concluded. "This is about whether we truly believe in equal treatment under law for all Americans, regardless of race, in every aspect of public life, including travel." Karen Whitfield had been subpoenaed but refused to appear in person, instead sending a written statement through her new attorney that still portrayed her as a victim of corporate policy while expressing regret for any misunderstanding. Her absence spoke volumes. When Trans-American Airways CEO Richard Dalton took the seat opposite Marcus, the contrast could not have been more stark. Where Marcus sat tall and spoke with clarity, Dalton hunched defensively, his prepared statement full of corporate jargon and careful evasions. "While we acknowledge that certain interactions did not meet our company standards," Dalton testified, "Trans-American Airways categorically denies any systematic discrimination in our policies or training." Senator Washington leaned forward. "Mr. Dalton, are you testifying under oath that your company does not engage in passenger profiling based on race?" "We have security protocols based on behavior, not race," Dalton replied carefully. "Then how do you explain this document?" The senator held up a printout from the leaked files. "This is an internal training presentation, instructing your staff on what you call heightened awareness passengers. The profile descriptions are thinly veiled racial categories." Dalton's face paled. "I'm not familiar with that specific document." "Senator, you should be. It bears your electronic signature on the approval line." Former Trans-American flight attendant Jasmine Richards testified next, describing how she had been trained to implement the discriminatory policies and had eventually resigned over ethical concerns. "We were taught to use code words and plausible deniability," she explained. "But the message was clear about which passengers deserved extra scrutiny." Throughout the morning session, Dalton's demeanor grew increasingly uncomfortable. During the lunch recess, reporters observed him in heated conversation with the airline's attorneys, their gestures suggesting significant disagreement. When the I-High hearing resumed, something had clearly changed. Dalton returned with a smaller legal team, and the airline's chief counsel was conspicuously absent. Senator Washington recognized a new witness, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division Director Anthony Patel. who announced that the DOJ investigation had uncovered substantial evidence of coordinated discrimination and subsequent attempts to conceal those practices. As Patel detailed the preliminary findings, including potential criminal charges for document destruction and privacy violations, the color drained from Dalton's face. During Senator Washington's follow-up questions, she presented the airline's confidential passenger management protocols that had been secured through subpoena, showing a clear racial coding system for identifying passengers who should receive additional scrutiny when seated in premium cabins. "Mr. Dalton," the senator said, her voice steady, "your company's own documents contradict your testimony today. Would you like to amend your statements before this committee?" After a whispered consultation with his remaining attorney, Dalton cleared his throat. "Senator, in light of information that has recently come to my attention, I would like to revise my earlier statements." The admission that followed was stunning in its scope. Dalton acknowledged that the airline had implemented discriminatory practices, covered up complaints, and orchestrated the campaign against Marcus after the incident. His carefully constructed denials collapsed entirely under the weight of overwhelming evidence. As the hearing concluded, Senator Washington addressed Marcus directly. "Brigadier General, your courage in bringing these matters to light has performed a service to the nation every bit as valuable as your distinguished military career. This committee will be recommending comprehensive reforms to ensure such discrimination cannot continue." For Marcus, who had risked everything to stand up for this principle, the senator's words provided a measure of vindication. But as he left the hearing room through a gauntlet of cameras and reporters, he knew that the greatest challenges often come after the apparent victory. The morning after the congressional hearing, Trans-American Airways issued a terse press release. The board of directors announces the immediate resignation of CEO Richard Dalton and 3 executive vice presidents. An interim leadership team will implement comprehensive policy reforms, while the search for permanent replacements is conducted. By afternoon, news broke that Karen Whitfield had been terminated from her position. Hours later, the Department of Justice announced she would face federal charges for assault and civil rights violations, with potential penalties including substantial fines and possible incarceration. Trans-American stock continued its downward spiral until the company announced a major settlement package, including substantial financial compensation for Marcus and others who had faced discrimination, along with an overhauled training program and transparent reporting mechanisms for bias incidents. Industry publications reported that other major carriers were proactively reviewing their own policies, fearful of similar scrutiny. The Federal Aviation Administration issued new guidelines for anti-discrimination compliance, informally dubbed the Washington Standards after the case that prompted them. For Marcus, these developments brought a complex mixture of vindication and exhaustion. While he had become a reluctant symbol for military veterans facing discrimination, the personal cost had been enormous. His PTSD symptoms, triggered and intensified by the ordeal, required ongoing therapy. Despite his reinstated promotion, colleagues treated him differently now, some with newfound respect, others with careful distance, as though his stand for principle might somehow be contagious. At the Pentagon, his assigned duties seemed designed to keep him visible as a success story, but away from operational command, a showcase general rather than a battlefield leader. After fighting so hard to defend his military career, Marcus found its trajectory permanently altered in ways he hadn't anticipated. Aisha had ultimately been accepted to West Point after the admissions scandal broke, but the family continued to receive occasional threats and harassment from extremists who had found in Karen Whitfield an unlikely martyr for their cause. Marcus hired private security for his daughter's graduation, turning what should have been a purely proud moment into one tinged with vigilance. 6 months after the hearing, Marcus sat alone in his Pentagon office, reviewing reports but finding his mind wandering. Had the victory been worth its price? He had won by every external measure, yet sometimes in the quiet moments, doubt still crept in. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. His aide announced that the newly appointed CEO of Trans-American Airways, Diana Chen, was requesting a meeting at his convenience. Marcus agreed with some reluctance, expecting perhaps another attempt at damage control or public relations. Instead, what Chen proposed during their meeting the following day left him momentarily speechless. "Brigadier General, we're creating a new executive position leading our Inclusion and Respect Division," Chen explained. "This isn't window dressing. This role will have authority over training, policy implementation, complaint investigation, and direct report to the board. We want you to consider taking this position." "You want to hire the man who sued you?" Marcus asked, unable to hide his surprise. "We want to hire the man who exposed fatal flaws in our system and held us accountable," Chen replied. "Your military leadership experience, your personal integrity, and yes, your first-hand experience with our failures make you uniquely qualified. We need transformation, not just damage control." Marcus's initial instinct was to refuse outright. But as Chen detailed the scope of authority the position would carry, including veto power over any policy that could enable discrimination, he found himself considering the possibility. From this position, he could implement changes that would affect millions of travelers, ensuring others wouldn't face what he had endured. After 2 weeks of careful consideration and discussions with both military advisors and his family, Marcus made his decision. He would accept an early retirement from the army and take on the challenge of reforming the very company that had once tried to destroy him. It was, he realized, another form of service to a different kind of battle to change systems from within, rather than merely winning individual victories against them. 6 months into his role as Executive Vice President for Inclusion and Respect at Trans-American Airways, Marcus Washington had already implemented sweeping changes. Every employee from baggage handlers to pilots underwent comprehensive bias recognition, training not corporate box-checking exercises, but substantive programs developed with civil rights organizations and backed by real accountability measures. His insistence on data transparency had resulted in a public dashboard showing complaint statistics and resolution timelines. An independent review board with diverse membership now oversaw all discrimination complaints, removing the conflicts of interest that had previously buried valid grievances. Most significantly, Marcus had established an industry-first Fair Skies initiative that invited external civil rights observers to conduct random, anonymous audits of passenger treatment across demographics. The initial findings had been sobering, but the improvement trends were encouraging. Not everyone supported these changes. A vocal minority of employees resisted what they characterized as political correctness gone mad. Some executives still attempted to circumvent the new policies. But with the board's backing and Chen's unwavering support, Marcus pushed forward, knowing that meaningful change never comes without resistance. On a crisp autumn morning, Marcus received an unexpected message. Karen Whitfield, now awaiting trial on federal charges, had requested a meeting. His immediate response was refusal. Why revisit that trauma? But after reflection, he recognized that his own healing might remain incomplete without this conversation. They met at a neutral location, a private room in a downtown mediation center. Karen looked markedly different from the confident flight attendant or the tearful victim she had portrayed on television, smaller somehow, and genuinely aged by stress. Security protocols meant they were never alone together, but the mediators maintained a respectful distance. "I didn't ask you here for forgiveness," Karen began after an uncomfortable silence. "I don't expect that, and I'm not sure I deserve it." What followed was not an excuse but an explanation. Karen described growing up in a household where racial prejudice was taught as truth, reinforced by a community that valued homogeneity above all. She detailed how those early teachings had hardened into biases that she had never properly examined until they cost her everything. "I believed I was just doing my job, following protocols," she admitted. "It took losing everything to make me question why I saw certain passengers as inherent threats." Marcus listened without interrupting. He recognized the courage it took to acknowledge such deeply rooted failings, even while maintaining a clear view of the harm those failings had caused. "I can't offer forgiveness on behalf of everyone you've mistreated over the years," Marcus finally said. "That's not mine to give. But I can acknowledge your humanity, just as you failed to acknowledge mine that day on the plane." Though they would never be friends or even comfortable acquaintances, both left the meeting with a sense that a necessary conversation had occurred, not a neat resolution with forgiveness and redemption, but a human exchange that acknowledged the complexity of prejudice and the long, difficult path to its dismantling. Using his portion of the settlement money, Marcus established the Washington Foundation, supporting veterans facing discrimination while also funding educational programs to help young people recognize and challenge bias in their communities. The Foundation's first initiative provided legal assistance to veterans without the connections or platform Marcus had leveraged in his own battle. On Capitol Hill, the Transportation Equality Act, informally known as the Washington Act, established new federal standards for non-discrimination in all forms of public transportation. Senator Eleanor Washington, who had championed the legislation, invited Marcus to stand beside her at the signing ceremony. 1 year to the day after the original incident, Marcus found himself boarding a trans-American flight from Washington to Atlanta. It was a deliberate choice this time, not for his mother's funeral, but to visit her grave properly, without media cameras or public scrutiny. As he approached the gate, he noticed the diverse team working the flight. The gate agent, a young black woman, checked his boarding pass with professional courtesy. The flight attendant greeting passengers at the door, a middle-aged Hispanic man, welcomed him by name and rank, the respect evident but not performative. Taking his seat in first class, Marcus felt no eyes questioning his presence, no subtle indications that he didn't belong. It wasn't special treatment. The other passengers of various backgrounds received the same dignified service. This was simply how air travel should always have been: respectful, professional, and blind to irrelevant differences. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Aisha. Attached was her official acceptance letter to the Air Force Academy, along with her selection for a prestigious leadership program. "They said my personal statement about what happened to you was the most compelling they'd read in years," she wrote. "Your fight opened doors, Dad, not just for me." Looking out at the clouds below, Marcus finally allowed himself to fully feel what he had been too busy to process: a sense of closure, not perfect or complete, but substantial enough to build upon. The incident that had nearly destroyed his career, threatened his family, and pushed him to the edge of despair had ultimately led to tangible changes that would benefit countless others. He thought about his mother, who had always taught him that standing up for principle wasn't measured by immediate victory, but by the ripples created over time. As the plane continued toward Atlanta, Brigadier General Marcus Washington closed his eyes and finally allowed himself to grieve properly for her and to feel, however tentatively, a sense of pride in the legacy his stand had created. The transformation wasn't complete, it never would be, as long as human prejudice existed. But systems could be changed, accountability established, and expectations raised. Sometimes, all it took was one person refusing to accept what had always been tolerated, making one call that others couldn't or wouldn't make, and withstanding the storm that followed. The story of Brigadier General Marcus Washington reveals profound truths about courage, systemic change, and the price of standing up for justice. His journey teaches us that true transformation often begins with a single act of principled resistance. While institutions may initially close ranks to protect themselves, the truth, when persistently pursued, has the power to create lasting change. This narrative highlights how discrimination operates not just through individual bias, but through systematic policies that enable and protect such behavior. Marcus's fight shows that dismantling these systems requires evidence, allies, and unwavering determination despite overwhelming personal costs. The story also illuminates the cruel irony faced by those who challenge discrimination. They often suffer additional harm through character assassination, professional retaliation, and personal attacks. Yet it demonstrates that building coalitions across racial and professional lines can create unstoppable momentum for justice. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus's journey reveals that real change requires both accountability for past wrongs and structural reforms to prevent future harm. His decision to work within the transformed system rather than simply winning his individual battle represents the hardest and most necessary form of courage: the willingness to engage in the long, unglamorous work of institutional change. The transformation wasn't complete. It never could be as long as human prejudice exists. But systems can be changed, accountability established, and expectations raised. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to accept what has always been tolerated, making one call that others couldn't or wouldn't make, and withstanding the storm that follows. What would you do if faced with discrimination like Marcus? Experienced? Would you have the courage to stand your ground even when powerful forces aligned against you? Comment below with a time you witnessed or experienced discrimination and how you responded. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button to help others find this important message. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that expose injustice and celebrate those brave enough to fight it. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the real human cost of racism and the difference one principled stand can make. Thank you for joining us on this journey toward understanding injustice. Remember, lasting change begins with ordinary people making extraordinary choices in difficult moments.